Hey, you're watching my official compilation channel, but if you want to see my newest videos as soon as they're uploaded, check out my main channel, Chat History. Alright, enjoy the video. Your morbid curiosity got the best of you, didn't it? Alright, well here's even more evil human experiments. Part 3! Usually when you think of World War II, chemical weapons are not the first thing that comes to mind, and that's because almost everyone learned their lesson in World War I. Except Japan, of course, who used them heavily against China. But they would learn two big lessons later on. But on the Western Front, chemical weapons were rarely used for fear of heavy retaliation. However, precautionary measures still had to be taken in the event that they were used. In order to design effective protective equipment, one has to learn what they're dealing with. Enter the mustard gas experiments, secret tests conducted by the United States to gain more insight into the effects of mustard gas on soldiers. Now you might be asking, what about all those soldiers killed during World War I? Well, you'd actually be surprised to learn that out of the estimated 17 million or so deaths attributed to the Great War, only about 90,000 were from chemical weapons, with only a few thousand being directly from mustard gas. And that's only about 1/100%. That's not really a conclusive sample size. In order to paint a clearer picture of what they were dealing with, over 60,000 soldiers were voluntold to participate in these trials, often with zero knowledge of what they were about to experience. In total, there were 3 experimental designs for troops to partake in. The first, and the easiest, was the patch test. Liquid mustard gas was applied directly to the test subject's skin in order to observe any immediate effects. The second was the field test, where soldiers were deployed on a simulated battlefield and enveloped in a mustard gas cloud to test various protective equipment prototypes. The last design was the chamber test. Equipped with only makeshift gas masks, soldiers were locked in small chambers where mustard gas was piped in order to test its incapacitative properties. One soldier, Sergeant Rollins Edwards, recalls his horrific experience when enduring a chamber test at just 21 years old in 1943.
And it was just one little hut there. And they told us all to go in there, but don't put on your gas mask until you smell gas. And we all went in there, and I heard when the latch closed, it had a bar outside the door. This was plywood. And we all standing up in there, but I put my gas mask on right then. Well, the gas mask then was just paper and charcoal. When they turned that gas on from up top there, this guy started to scream because it was feel like there was a million red ants over you, just all over your whole complete body.
Keep in mind that mustard gas itself, while it can be lethal, had a very low mortality rate in World War I, only around 2 to 3%. Its main purpose was to incapacitate rather than kill. It was great at its job, but it was the British who decided to kick things up a notch with lewisite, a deadlier alternative to mustard gas. This was an arsenic-based compound capable of damaging your DNA on contact. Skin would blister, and your respiratory system would likely fail. But not only were these experiments aimed at observing the health effects on soldiers as a whole, but also how the chemicals may have affected different races. Black, Puerto Rican, Japanese, and white soldiers were tested separately, with the white soldiers being the control group, meaning that they were the baseline to compare to. If there was enough evidence to suggest that one group was more resistant than another, well, guess who's going to be sent on the front line? Of course, in the end, no such conclusive evidence was ever found, so good job with that one. Any soldier resisting participation was threatened with dishonorable discharge and jail time for failure to obey commands. During these experiments, soldiers were subjected to agonizing pain and trauma, which resulted in permanent physical and psychological damage for the rest of their lives. These men were scarred with chemical burns on their skin, their eyes, and even in their lungs. Those who endured these experiments as well as survived any future combat, because these soldiers were still expected to fight in the war, were unable to seek any medical attention once discharged from service. They were sworn to secrecy, lest they face legal backlash for disclosing information about a confidential operation. While you might be sitting there waving your finger at the United States, know that it wasn't just the wonderful freedom powerhouse who did this kind of stuff. The mustard gas experiments actually took place years after the good old redcoats did the same thing in Australia, England, Canada, and India, which is probably when the British developed their aversion to anything remotely spicy. Now here's a topic that'll probably get me canceled. Way back in the day in 1965, 2 twin baby boys slopped out of their mother. Bruce and Brian Reimer. As cute as they were, they had a bit of a problem. Both boys were born with phimosis, an odd medical condition that, in monetizable terms, meant that they had trouble peeing properly due to a non-retractable skin on their little fellas. Well, that's not the worst. I mean, just a simple circumcision would pop those turtles right out of their shell, right? Normally, yes, if you have a decent doctor. A description apparently not befitting of Bruce's doctor. The physician who performed this rather routine surgery decided to be a bit unconventional and cauterized the freshly cut skin rather than a traditional stitching. This deviation from standard procedure rendered Bruce's manhood completely non-functional at just 8 months old. Outraged, the Reimer parents refused to have Brian undergo the same treatment, so his jacket still had its hood. With Bruce's medically malpracticed member, Reimer's parents eventually found one Dr. John Money, which sounds more like the prim and proper version of Johnny Cash, except Money would be performing a lot more hurt. Dr. John Money was a medical psychology professor at Johns Hopkins University. His research centered on theories of gender identity and gender roles. He would eventually pioneer the process of chemical castration, a drug treatment on sex offenders to completely eliminate their violent desires, which is pretty cool. But what's not cool is his role in the life of Bruce Reimer. After the Reimer family got in contact with Dr. Money, they were advised to have Bruce's remaining male parts surgically removed and to swap teams, undergoing gender reassignment and instead being raised as a girl. Bewildered, the parents agreed, and at just 2 years old, Bruce Reimer became Brenda Reimer. Although later in life, Bruce stated that he never really identified as female. But Dr. Money didn't stop there. He pushed further and tried to upsell just beyond the base model. Looks like little Brenda's gonna need some hormone treatment, and while you're at it, I can throw in a vagina as well. It'll look like a chewed up wad of gum, but it'll do the trick. We're just gonna take the hormone treatment? Thanks. No one ever wants the vagina. But this is where things started to really take a turn. You see, Money had a theory, one that explored the influences of nature versus nurture as it pertains to gender identity. He believed that such identities are instilled upon us through our upbringing rather than our biological traits. And this would culminate into one of the most strange and disturbing experiments I've ever read about. So thanks, YouTube comments section. Appreciate that. In what I can only assume would be a way to further his research, both Brenda and Brian regularly visited Dr. Money for routine checkups to see how the change had impacted their relationship and well-being. At just 6 years old, Money began exposing the children to explicit adult content. Even worse, he reportedly forced the two children to reenact certain poses featured in these films and had, at least on one occasion, taken pictures of the children doing this. Both children had reported incidents of Dr. Money's temper when resisting such requests. They stated that although he was calm and well-mannered in the presence of their parents, he became violent and verbally abusive behind closed doors. When discussing the events years later, Brenda recalled one specific event where Dr. Money had yelled at him for refusing to undress when both children were forced to inspect each other. Years later, a now teenage Brenda was propositioned by Money to undergo a full transition surgery, but Brenda repeatedly and adamantly refused. After years of, let's not sugarcoat it, full-blown sexual abuse, Brenda hit a psychological breaking point. It was at this time that the Reimer parents broke the truth to Brenda that he was born as a boy. And immediately, Brenda abandoned life as a girl, took on the name David, and even underwent reconstructive surgeries to restore damage done to him. Dr. Money, however, fraudulently reported his work as a successful female gender development, using it as evidence to support future gender reassignment cases. But in 1997, David came forward with his story to discredit Dr. Money, speaking to the horrors of his upbringing and the mental toll it took on both him and his brother. David's testimony was published across several high-profile magazines, but as freeing as it was to tell his story, it wasn't enough to free him from his mental anguish. In 2004, David had taken his own life at age 38, just 2 years after his brother, Brian, had overdosed on antidepressants. Dr. Money had brushed off David's testimony as merely right-wing and anti-feminist propaganda. According to the Intersex Society of North America, however, many individuals within the intersex community had condemned Money for falsifying his report, as it had led to thousands of surgical procedures done on infants as a matter of policy. Over the following years, Money would continue to have many of his theories debunked by his own social experiments. He never faced any consequences for his explicit actions with the Reimer twins or any other families that he had impacted with his practices. John Money ultimately cashed out of this mortal coil in 2006 at the age of 85. As an added kick to the butchered dick, even though Brian never had the surgery to cure his phimosis, you know, that condition that kickstarted this whole thing, it eventually corrected itself with age. So it is likely that Bruce would have also outgrown this condition, sparing both brothers from their cruel fate. But hey, hindsight's 2020. It's not real. During the complete shit stain on South African history that was apartheid, there was an infectious disease running rampant through the South American military. Or at least it was thought of as a disease by some. And just like any other disease, there had to be a cure, right? Well, that's what Dr. Aubrey Levin claimed anyway. In 1967, the South African military began forced conscription of soldiers to beef up the military. Initially, homosexuality was outright banned in the military, so when joining, soldiers were examined by medical doctors to screen for any suspicious tendencies.
Why are you gay?
Any enlisted soldiers found to be lying about being straight were severely punished with imprisonment, but in reality, there was a strong concern over the opposite. It was actually feared that many men would lie about their preferences in order to avoid being conscripted. So how goes the conscription? Not good. Apparently everyone around here is gay. What? That's impossible. Is it? So instead, the rules were changed to allow those identifying as homosexual to be forced into military service. They just had to be cured is all. So those individuals were sent to a secret military hospital to unwillingly partake in Dr. Levin's many cures. This is where the Aversion Project began. Soldiers, which now found themselves amongst a population of drug addicts and the severely mentally ill, were strapped into chairs and forced to watch many explicit adult films of the he on him variety. Nice. These patients sustained aggressive electrical shocks while viewing the films, up to 120 volts and about 800 milliamps, which is super painful and potentially lethal. The theory was that if repeatedly shocked, the brain would eventually rewire itself to anticipate pain when thinking of the naughty dude thoughts. You know, a Clockwork Orange style. The tests continued, but Levin failed to get any of the results that he had anticipated. In response, he upped the ante by continuing the aggressive shock therapy in conjunction with deep-throating depressant drugs to make the victims' brains more susceptible to change. Despite this outright torture, the desired effects were never achieved, and no cure had occurred. Although it does have to be said that some soldiers simply faked that they were cured in order to escape these torturous experiments. As a last-ditch effort to stop any of these so-called unnatural desires from ever occurring again, Levin had these soldiers chemically castrated against their will before being released from the hospital. Now, tragically, this took a huge psychological and physical toll on the victims, and many ended up taking their own lives shortly after release. Dr. Levin went back to the drawing board and came up with one more attempt at a cure: forced gender reassignment. You see, if you like dudes and you're a dude, well, that's just silly, but if you're now a girl and you still like dudes, well, then it's a-okay. Several soldiers were forced to undergo the surgery, and not many survived. Those who did suffered extreme medical issues for the rest of their lives. Survivors were given new identities and forbidden from contacting anyone from their old life. But the horror didn't stop there. In order to keep his failed experiments out of the public light, Dr. Levin oversaw the construction of Greifswald, a forced labor camp where any of his subjects that were considered incurable would reside. It wasn't until 1975, 7 years after his initial tests began, that the nightmare finally ended after Dr. Levin received a promotion. He left the military to become the Director of Mental Health for the South African Department of Health Services and Welfare. Of course, justice would never be served. After apartheid ended in 1995, Levin fled to Canada where he lived comfortably as a psychology professor. He was charged in an unrelated crime in 2010 and sentenced to 5 years imprisonment, but he was ultimately released just 18 months later on parole. And as of this video, he is 86 years old and still alive today as a free man. In the midst of the Cold War, rumors began to spread across the continents of Soviet brainwashing. American prisoners of war released after the Korean War were witnessed to be shadows of the men they once were, often regurgitating communist ideals to which they were apparently subjected to repeatedly during their capture. Some other men outright refused to return to American soil and fully defected to the USSR. Traitors. But these obvious tells of psychological manipulation struck fear into the vacuous heart of the American government. The CIA director at the time, Allen Dulles, condemned such actions, calling out the communist brainwashing as abhorrent and nefarious. He went on to state how such war tactics were beneath American values and even human values as a whole. So in order to ensure that this would never happen on American soil, Director Dulles, just 3 days after his little speech, approved Project MKUltra, the United States' very own mind control experimentation program. Sure, Dulles may have said that mind control is un-American, but losing is even un-American-er. The main goal of MKUltra was to develop ways to control human behavior and ultimately develop a truth serum, be it a physical substance or a specific technique. This would be especially helpful with things like espionage or interrogating enemy prisoners of war. Hey, it's only evil if the enemy does it. MKUltra was composed of several different methods for perfecting the art of psychological manipulation. These included hypnosis, electroshock therapy, and administering experimental drugs, the most pervasive of which being the forced administration of LSD. Now, these tactics were not limited to just prisoners of war. Those are way too scarce in numbers. In order to get more promising and conclusive data, you need a larger population. Well, that's nothing a few prisons, psych wards, and the US Army can't supply. Wait, what? The head honcho of MKUltra was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, one of the CIA's top biochemists. Under his guidance, and with generous funding from the CIA, experiments began across North America in over 30 institutions and universities, including Columbia University and Stanford University. Experiments were later expanded to Canada too, but let's start domestically. MKUltra was set in motion in 1953, where the first candidate for this mythical truth serum was tested: lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, a powerful synthetic hallucinogen developed in 1938 in Switzerland. I originally wanted to develop a new respiratory stimulant, and I did, but now I can also taste colors. That's pretty cool too. Tons of this stuff was purchased by the CIA for use in MKUltra, roughly $4.2 million worth in today's money. In true evil experiment fashion, test subjects were never given explicit knowledge of what they were about to experience, only that they would be participating in some sort of test. And these subjects were either convicted criminals or mentally ill patients who either had no choice in participation or the ability to comprehend what they were about to go through. Former organized crime boss guy Whitey Bulger was one such patient, and he wrote about his experience as a government lab rat in 1957. He recalled being injected with what he later found out to be LSD. Here's an excerpt from his writings. 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state. Total loss of appetite. Hallucinating. The room would change shape. Hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning into skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane. Yeah, it was really rough stuff, and maybe some people in the audience can attest to some experience like this. Let me know in the comments if Bulger's testimony sounds something like you've gone through. You little deviants, you. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about the appropriately named Operation Midnight Climax. This was a rather risque covert operation where several CIA-funded women of the night would lure unsuspecting and rather anxious men into CIA safe houses across California and New York. These men, unfortunately, would only have their minds blown as they were well supplied with drinks laced with LSD. CIA agents would observe these festivities from behind a two-way mirror as these dudes absolutely lost their goddamn minds. Athletic little fella, isn't he? You think that's bad? Well, the Canadians weren't much better. Dr. Donald Cameron developed the concept of psychic driving, a nightmarish experiment aimed at erasing memories and reprogramming the human brain. In addition to the usual LSD administration, Dr. Cameron also performed intense electroshock therapy, often at 30 to 40 times the normal power. Patients were put into drug-induced comas for weeks on end and forced to listen to looping audio clips. These patients were often diagnosed with anxiety disorders and postpartum depression. So imagine coming into a hospital, having anxiety, and being strapped into a chair, injected with drugs, electrically shocked, and forced to listen to the same audio looping for weeks on end. Needless to say, these victims suffered permanent physiological damage, including complete amnesia and losing the ability to speak. Project MKUltra came to an abrupt end in 1973 when all of the classified documents were ordered to be destroyed after government-wide panic began following the events of the Watergate incident. You know, when President Nixon's re-election campaign staff were found secretly spying on their political opponents. This sparked a huge public distrust of the government and was a catalyst for many investigations of the government for foul play. Despite the purge of documentation, over 20,000 documents survived, which were subsequently investigated and brought into the public eye a year later. In 1976, President Ford signed an executive order banning any drug experimentation on human subjects without written and witness-informed consent. Dr. Gottlieb, who conveniently retired from the CIA in 1973, faced no consequences for his role in MKUltra and ultimately brushed off the project as ineffective and a waste of time. He died peacefully in his home in 1999. If you're going to be executed, you'd probably want the process to be relatively quick and painless, be it one fell swoop from the guillotine, a short drop and a sudden stop, or just getting injected with night-night juice. But sometimes, things don't go according to plan. So let's see how it all went wrong for a few poor unfortunate souls. If you're getting your melon chopped off, you're going to want two things, a sharp blade and a trained executioner. Poor Margaret Pole got maybe one of those. Once the very wealthy Countess of Salisbury, not the steak, Margaret fell from the good graces of King Henry VIII when she went all girl boss on him for divorcing his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. Henry brushed this off, but was set over the edge when Margaret's very influential Catholic cardinal son, Reginald Pole, also scolded him, but from a safe distance over in Italy.
Hey Henry, you suck!
The proud Protestant king responded, being all right, bet, and imprisoned Margaret, Reginald, and the rest of her family in the Tower of London.
That'll teach you.
Margaret was held for 2.5 years in the Tower in actually pretty fair conditions, with her own personal servants and lavish clothing, until one morning when she got a surprise visitor. Hey Margaret, how's it going? You look great, by the way. I love that dress. So listen, yeah, you're gonna be executed today. Okay, bye. That morning on May 27th, 1541, Margaret was led to a courtyard to have her dome knocked off. Unfortunately for her, the main executioner had been sent away to fight some rebels, so his intern filled in. Generally, executions are supposed to be swift and smooth. Not this one. The inexperienced executioner couldn't chop worth shit, so he ended up just hacking Margaret's back and neck to bits. Oops. 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 It took 11 swings to finally detach head from body. Now, if you're going to be executed, you might as well have done something pretty cool to deserve it. Take Robert Francois Damier, for example. As a very French man, he hated his very French king, King Louis XV, because reasons. Well, in 1757, he decided to channel that hatred into something productive, like developing an elaborate plan to kill the king. As the merry monarch was entering his carriage at the Palace of Versailles, Damier mashed the A button to rush past the bodyguards and stab the king with a penknife. Fortunately for King Louis, his thick-ass royal king coat was thick enough to stop the pen from doing any severe damage, and the pen only penetrated less than half of an inch into his chest, causing nothing but a flesh wound. Damier was immediately arrested, convicted, and sentenced to be drawn and quartered by horses. Now, if you're unfamiliar with such an execution method, it's exactly as it sounds. No, not that. There we go. A rope is tied around each limb and strapped to a horse. 4 limbs, 4 horses. They then pull in opposite directions until your limbs pop out of their sockets one by one. Real fun stuff. Well, that's how it's supposed to go. Reportedly, Damier had stubborn anatomy that just refused to separate at all. So, to make things a little bit easier, his arms and legs had their tendons cut to make the ripping easier. After his last limb detached, he was reported to have still been alive. So his stumpy, bloody torso was burned to finish the job. Bit overkill for a little scratch with a penknife, but whatever. Thomas Ketchum, who has no relation to the world-famous Pokemon trainer, was an infamous American outlaw who would give Arthur Morgan a run for his money.
Quack, quack.
Ketchum, also known as Black Jack, had his own posse of cowboys for some rootin' tootin', robbin' and shootin'. Ketchum and his gang terrorized the Wild West in the late 1800s with a string of shootouts, robberies, murders, but they had bigger ambitions with heftier payouts. That's when Tom decided to go for gold. Literal gold. On trains. He was gonna rob trains. With his brother Sam at his side, the two robbed trains to the tune of a modern-day equivalent of a few $1 million over the years. But eventually, their luck ran out. On a solo run, Sam was injured in a shootout, arrested, and died of an infection of his wounds a few days later. Tom, unaware that his brother just bit the dust robbing a train, made an attempt on the very same train just a month later. At this point, the train conductor's a little sick of getting robbed, so he pulled an Uno reverse card on Tom, using a shotgun to blast away his elbow. The train chugged away and Tom was left injured on the wayside, where he was later arrested by law enforcement. For his countless crimes over the years, Tom was sentenced to death by hanging. Unfortunately for Tom, though, the small New Mexico town had no experience actually hanging a man, so they did the best they could. Gallows? Check. Prisoner? Check. Length of hanging rope? I don't know. The gallows were tested with a 200-pound sack of flour, which seemed to have been successful. But the problem here is that the same rope that was tested was reused for the execution, so that 200-pound sack made the rope really tight. Since Tom was notorious at this point, crowds flocked to witness his execution. On April 26, 1901, the rope was placed around Tom's neck and the trapdoor was sprung. The townsfolk ended up getting way more than they bargained for. The long, tight rope instantly decapitated Tom once he reached the apex of his final descent. He should have quit, but now he's just ahead. But at least it made a cool postcard. Hey, quick side note here. So I'm realizing that there's like no image resources for this section, so I hope you don't mind some crude artwork. King Kalorso GL was the second woman in Thai history to be put to death by gunfire. Being a nanny to the 6-year-old son of a wealthy business family, she was promptly fired because... But that didn't sit too well with her. In a desperate attempt to get some money, she, along with several accomplices, had kidnapped the 6-year-old for ransom. They had demanded 200,000 Thai baht, or $6,000, for the release of the boy. After the terrified family failed to follow the exact directions of where to bring the ransom money, the young boy was brutally beaten and buried alive. GL had attempted to save the boy with whom she had grown fond of, but failed to do so. GL and her accomplices were quickly arrested and sentenced to death by firing squad. Now, Thailand did firing squads a bit different from what you'd expect. Instead of lining a blindfolded prisoner to a wall with several gunmen taking aim, the prisoner is instead tied facing backward on a wooden cross. A concealing screen is put up with a target pointing in the vicinity of the prisoner's heart, and a rifle is lined up to the target. A single executioner is instructed to fire up to 15 shots at the target, guaranteeing the prisoner's death. On January 13th, 1979, GL was executed and carted off to the morgue, and all seemed to have been successful. But that thought quickly evaporated once GL was found screaming her frickin' head off in the morgue and attempting to stand up. But why wasn't the execution successful, you might ask? Well, I'll tell you if you just wait a minute. Jeez. It turns out that GL's genetics played a prank on her. She was diagnosed with situs inversus, meaning that all of her organs were mirrored to how they normally should be, with her heart on her right side of her chest rather than her left. So those initial shots all missed her heart entirely, and instead of killing her, just ended up hurting a lot. She was instantly pulled from the morgue, set up once more on the cross, and given another volley of justice seeds to the back. When it comes to new inventions, they usually go through rigorous testing and tweaks to perfect their function before being put on the market for commercial use. Well, since the electric chair wasn't a commercial product, who cares? Improvements can be made later on once enough testing is performed. William Kemmler was such a test subject. A poor businessman and a drunk, Kemmler often found himself in trouble. According to an article in the New York Times, on March 29, 1889, Kemmler was recovering from a drinking binge the night before when he became enraged with his wife, Tilly Ziegler. He accused her of stealing from him and preparing to run away with a friend of his. When the argument had reached a peak, Kemmler calmly went to the barn out back, grabbed a hatchet, and returned to the house. He struck Tilly repeatedly, killing her. He then went to a neighbor's house and announced that he had just murdered his wife. Kemmler was arrested, swiftly convicted of first-degree murder, and sentenced to be executed by a brand new invention. On August 6, 1890, Kemmler was brought to the chair. He reportedly did not resist in any way and willingly accepted his punishment. After being secured and wishing everyone farewell, the switch was thrown. 1,000 volts were put through Kemmler's body for 17 agonizing seconds. Kemmler was unconscious, but alive. The voltage was doubled and power was thrown again. This is where things became spectacular. It was reported by witnesses that Kemmler's blood vessels ruptured and bled under his skin and his entire body caught fire. The entire execution room filled with the foul odor of burning flesh, causing many witnesses to panic and flee. The execution lasted 8 terrifying minutes. An autopsy showed that Kemmler's skull had burnt to a crisp and his brain cooked to a tender medium rare.
It looks stunning.
The New York Times later published a review stating that the executioner would have done better with an axe. Secret spy gadgets, huh? You know all about the Cold War, right? It was that time between the 1940s and 1980s where the United States of America and the United States of Soviet Russia, or whatever it stood for, decided to really duke it out on whose economic system was superior for worldwide domination. Capitalism or communism? But since the USSR is nowhere to be found on a modern map and over 300 versions of Monopoly are available on the market, it's pretty clear who won. Now, it was called the Cold War because neither superpower actually fought each other directly. Instead, everything was just one big wiener measuring competition, from who could build better weapons to who could make more countries kill each other. But sometimes, sneaky measures were taken to get the upper hand. And that's where spies came in. Highly trained agents designed to infiltrate enemy lines and carefully yoink critical information from the other side, among other fruitful missions. But they needed to be creative in their method of extracting information to avoid getting caught. Good spies don't get caught. Perhaps the most common tool in a spy's arsenal was the hidden camera. In order to follow the cardinal rule of pics or it didn't happen, these discreet little lenses were used to secretly take pictures of sensitive documents or sensitive people without being too obvious. Это на сумме секретный документ. Really? Could you flip that over, please? Yes, of course. The clever cameras were carefully concealed in copious quantities of clothes and components like coats, coins, and cleavage. Perhaps one of the most effective types was the microdot camera, a tiny camera used to make even tinier pictures. About the size of a small coin, these little wonders captured images of full-size sensitive documents, but thanks to a special lens and some fancy physics, the resulting image would be scaled down to just a dot. A microdot, if you will. These microdots measured about a millimeter in length and could easily be snuck back into headquarters where they could be magnified and properly read. Gotcha. But taking pictures of a few confidential documents was small-time work. Sometimes you need to think bigger, like entire secret bases bigger. So in order to get a bird's eye view on the landscape, you had to do just that. That's where the employment and deployment of pigeon cameras came in. Specially trained pigeons that had big old cameras strapped to their chests and sent flying across areas where the camera could reveal potential bases and strategic locations. But if seeing wasn't an option, then listening was an acceptable alternative. It was a common tactic for intelligence operations to bug a room, meaning that multiple listening devices would be planted around said room or on an agent. But some smartass took the term bug a little too literal, which is how the dragonfly insectothopter became reality. But why oh why the dragonfly? Well, because a regular fly is too small and swattable, and while a prototype for a bumblebee was developed, it was noted that real bees are too erratic when they fly. And so if a couple of savvy sleuths noticed a bumblebee just kind of hovering around in the air, it was a telltale sign that your business was being recorded. Dragonflies, though, can kind of just hover for a while, and so it's a little less suspicious. Plus, their long, slender bodies were a perfect shape to house the mechanics necessary to be a microphone with wings. I'm sorry, how many missiles did you say in Cuba? Is there a lake nearby or something? But if you had insectophobia, then what could be the next best thing? This thing. The Thing. This vaguely named piece of woodwork was a hand-carved US Great Seal gifted by the Soviet Union to a US ambassador a few weeks before World War II ended. I guess the USSR wanted to get an early jump on the whole spying thing. It was hung up in the ambassador's private study as a way to passively listen in on conversations. But how? Hidden in the wood carving was an antenna that, although mechanically simple, was pretty impressive technology. Invented by Leon Tiedemann, who is famous for also inventing the theremin, that weird frequency instrument that goes all. This listening device had no power source or wires, rendering it virtually undetectable. No way. Instead, a remote radio frequency would turn on the device, allowing the Soviets to actively listen in whenever those perverts pleased. Classified as a resonant cavity microphone, it was basically a tiny diaphragm that would vibrate from sound waves of people yapping. Those vibrations are then transformed into a signal which was sent back to the Soviets. The device was so well hidden that it actually wasn't found until 7 years later. Yo Dave, check this out, the Soviets put a freaking microphone in the seal. Those commie bastards were listening this whole time? I'm gonna rip it out. No, wait. I have an idea. Time to listen in on the Americans. I hate my job. Now you might be thinking, man, microphones and cameras? That shit's lame on God for real, or whatever the flip y'all say today. Well, if I were mean, this is where I would put something loud to blow out your eardrums in retaliation. But I'm not gonna do that. Next up in the spy arsenal, sounds like an idea that someone just pulled out of their ass. You ever see like a Swiss Army knife with its super convenient and practical tools like knives and saws and screwdrivers? Now imagine if you got the sudden urge to just ram that thing up your anatomical back pocket for later retrieval in a pinch. Well, you're in luck I guess, because that's what the rectal toolkit is for. Hey, at least it's better than a glass jar. Used mainly by very brave CIA agents at the height of the Cold War, this toolkit was equipped with all the aforementioned tools needed to get yourself out of a shitty situation, all conveniently contained in a ribbed for your pleasure capsule. Although convenient, there might be a few obvious tells of the supportive suppository. Alright, the guards are distracted. Let's move out. I'm right behind you. Oh geez. Sometimes a spy needs a quick getaway. Luckily, there are plenty of opportunities at your disposal. Perhaps a spy's best offense was a solid defense of remaining anonymous and indiscernible amongst a crowd. Many spies were artists in terms of changing disguises on the fly to get any would-be pursuers off their trail. But if changing clothes didn't do the trick, then the 5-second mask would. This was a latex mask developed for quick identity theft on the go. In just 5 seconds, as the name implies, one could assume an entirely new appearance from the shoulders up, complete with facial hair and a hairline that screams, "I've got a mortgage, an unsatisfied wife, and 3 ungrateful brats at home." No enemy agents would suspect a thing, but they would certainly be sympathetic towards your new fake backstory, maybe even empathetic. Godspeed, soldier. But if you're still being tailed and need a quick diversion, it might be time to deploy the Jack-in-the-Box. Constructed from a hopefully unused sex doll, this inflatable fellow served as a decoy for a vehicular getaway. When getting Ubered away from a mission, you may get a feeling that you're being followed and need to quickly vamoose.
The enemy's coming in, you're behind. Do a barrel roll.
Assuming your driver knows the assignment and you tipped him well, he can quickly turn a corner while you delicately tuck and roll to safety. The Jack-in-the-Box is then quickly inflated where you were sitting, convincing your assailants that you didn't just take yourself out by slamming your dome into a street lamp at 35 miles an hour. However, there may be a chance where the jig is up and you get got. No need to worry though, they can't extract information from you if you're completely dead. You know that famous Pirates of the Caribbean quote.
Dead guys don't say things much.
The thing is, it's very unpatriotic to give up confidential information to an enemy entity. Traitors even. So in order to not disgrace your home country that put you in this dangerous pickle in the first place, you have one last resort. A lethal dose of cyanide hidden in your false tooth. Just gnaw on that sucker like one of grandma's old strawberry candies to earn your one-way ticket to Sleepy Bye Junction. Now, if you've got the stones for it and you want to fight back, that's where the real fun stuff begins, with an arsenal of concealed weapons at your disposal. This first one really packs a punch. This is the Sedgley OSS 38 single-shot glove pistol, a relatively simple weapon capable of delivering a very simple death. See, with a gun, you pull a trigger and your point comes across pretty quickly. With a glove gun, you get to punch them in the face while you're at it. It's like killing two birds with one stone, but it's killing one face with a bullet and a fist. So when you're in a bout of fisticuffs and your opponent insists you give him your best shot, boy will he be surprised. For you ladies out there looking to discreetly apply a nice shade of red to yourself and a target, there's the lipstick pistol, also referred to as the kiss of death. This little guy was a single-shot 4.5mm pistol hidden in a lipstick holder used by the KGB. They were the Soviet equivalent of the CIA. Easily disguised as a harmless accessory in a handbag, this weapon could be concealed next to your concealer and make up the foundation of your arsenal. I would imagine such an encounter would go like this. Oh wow, what a lovely shade. What color is that? It's called You're Gonna. You're gonna? Yeah, you're gonna die. You're gonna die. Ooh, how exotic sounding.
How does it look?
Ugh, okay, maybe such tactics are a little bit messy. Let's shoot for something more surreptitious, like poison. Poison's great when you're not on the receiving end of it. If you don't want the hassle of dirty work to rain on your parade, you can opt for the Bulgarian umbrella. This clever contraption looks like a typical umbrella, but it isn't. Obviously. This umbrella Ella actually contains a pneumatic element which, when triggered, will launch a poison dart towards any target you desire. The poison of choice was ricin, a potent chemical which, when injected, will cause massive internal bleeding and organ failure, guaranteed to put a damper on anyone's day. The Bulgarian umbrella is referred to as such because the most famous use of the device was in 1978 when a KGB agent assassinated a Bulgarian enemy of the state right in the middle of the streets of London.
Is someone there?
I suppose if you really want to take aim at who you're pumping full of poison, then equip yourself with the ominously named heart attack gun. Revealed to the general public in 1975, this firearm was, as the name implies, capable of delivering one free heart attack by means of a lethal injection of shellfish toxin right into the bloodstream. The toxin was discovered by one Miss Mary Embry of the CIA. Her discovery also played a major role in Project MK Naomi, a secret US program aimed at developing biological weapons during the Cold War and a successor to the infamous Project MK Ultra. The poison was frozen into a compact dart and fired at a high speed. Once it penetrated the target, it would melt and be absorbed into the body. The toxin would spread and mimic the symptoms of an innocent heart attack. Only a tiny red dot was the evidence that anything malicious had even happened, besides a dead body. If you've ever experienced the astronomical pain from stepping on a Lego, or the agonizing torment of waiting for a response after sending a risky text to someone you're about to find out has no interest in you, then you've experienced what true torture feels like. But people way back in the day were a little bit more sadistic when it comes to causing extremely unpleasant experiences. In fact, public torture and executions were something to look forward to. Yo Tom, I hear they're finally about to execute Jack the Jacker. You coming? No, but I bet he is. Anyway, I gotta go catch a movie with my third wife. Maybe next time. Catch a what? So anyway, here's 5 torture methods that you may not be familiar with. If you're not one to handle any kind of violence or blood or stuff like that, why did you even click this video? Well, I hope you're ready, because here we go. First, we have the pena collae, a form of Roman capital punishment which translates to the penalty of the sack. Now, before you get any ideas about someone being a brutal ball buster, this refers to an actual sack. This punishment was handed out to those who were convicted of patricide, the act of offing your own dad. The individual would be bound and placed in a leather sack, but not alone. An assortment of animals included dogs, snakes, chickens, or even monkeys were placed in the sack with you. The sack was then sewn up and tossed into a body of water, so not only did you drown, but you were also getting absolutely demolished by panicking animals who were also going to drown. This punishment must have been quite popular, as it had been used as far back as 100 BC up until the 1700s. The next method of torture showed that the English knew how to party. Designed in the early 1500s, the Scavengton's daughter, or the scavenger's daughter, served the opposite function as the famous rack. Nope, this rack. Instead of stretching the victim to look like a pool noodle, the scavenger's daughter compressed them until the ribs, chest, or spine dislocated. The goal of the device was not death, but simply to interrogate the victims, squeezing the truth as well as a couple organs out of them. The victim would be placed under an iron hoop which was able to be slowly compressed until the victim either confessed or died. It is said that the victims will often have blood shoot out of their ears and nostrils from the intense pressure. There is another device bearing the same name, but it operates under a different principle. The Spanish version, called La Scavenger's Daughter, worked by locking the victims in an excruciating and unnatural position, causing their joints to freeze up. But that can be quickly remedied with a few healthy stretches on the rack. Speaking of stretches, boy is this one a doozy. Take a look at this sucker. This is called the Pair of Anguish. What do you think it does? This bad boy right here, invented sometime around the 1600s, was theorized to also have been used as an extortion device, extracting confessions from victims. Leaving little to the imagination, the device is thought to have been inserted into the mouth, where it would be slowly opened, expanding the pair to the point of unhinging or breaking the jaw. There is also a possibility it may have been used in buttholes and hoo-has, though fortunately there is almost no evidence to support that this device was used in such a way. But to be fair, the Pair of Anguish looks like something you could buy off of Adam and Eve or at the back of a Spencer's. We're gonna move on to something a little less openy. Ah yes, here we have the Heretic's Fork, a device that looks like someone forgot where they put their wrench. Yet this is another truth extractor. Apparently a lot of people lied back then, unlike today. Used mainly during the highly unexpected Spanish Inquisition by the loving and inclusive Catholic Church to seek out non-believers, the device was affixed between the jaw and the chests of many victims. Both ends of the fork were pronged. One end would pierce under the chin while the other pierced the sternum. The length of the fork was customized for each use, making sure that the victim's head was tilted all the way back full stop. The victim would be unable to speak or sleep without experiencing excruciating pain. Typically, the forks were inscribed with the phrase, "I recant," meaning that the victim was physically unable to recant. If you didn't confess, you were tortured in worse fashions and eventually executed. But if you did confess, you had the pleasure of still being tortured for being a filthy heretic. A real win-win there. The good news is that even though it was used hundreds of years ago, you can still buy one off of Amazon for one low payment of $44.99, so keep your chin up. Okay folks, last one. You having a good time? Yeah, you are. The execution method called Ling Chi has been used for over 1,000 years, which is appropriate because it's also known as the death by 1,000 cuts. Reserved for only the most heinous of crimes, this form of punishment was used in China from the year 900 up to the early 1900s. Generally, the guilty would be restrained on a wooden post with one or multiple executioners cutting into them, usually starting off with small, slow incisions to maximize suffering, and then continuing on to larger and more damaging cuts, sometimes even severing whole limbs toward the end. Unfortunately for the victim, the process was never fully well defined, and that was left up to improvisation. Historical recounts of Ling Chi state that executions could be as quick as 20 minutes or as long as 3 days. Not only was the permanent damage to the human body bad for the victim while they were alive, obviously, but it was also believed that the damage inflicted would carry on into the afterlife, condemning them to be sliced and diced as a spooky spirit. Huge bummer. Evil human experiments. Alright fellas, let's start things off a little easy. Back in the 4th century BC, Greek civilization was reaching new heights. People were getting more and more curious about the world around us and began asking really important questions. What does that do? How does that work? Should I leave the oven on? How do magnets work? Will she call me back? Is this real life? Or is this just fantasy? Does the shrimp really fry the rice? Or not? All pretty valid questions for people just wishing to learn the workings of the natural world. While many focus on the mechanics of the universe, others chose to focus on the inner workings of humans themselves, and not only from a philosophical standpoint. Sometimes you just want to know what makes us tick. That's what Greek physician Herophilus wanted to find out and document in detail. After getting his education at the Hippocratean medical school in Greece, Herophilus turned his bulging eyes towards the city of Alexandria, Egypt, with its big, throbbing library chock full of scrolls just begging to be read. "Time to go to Egypt," he said, and so he did. Doot, doot, doot. After getting himself established and taking on a student, a young physician named Erasistratus, they got to work. Together, the two men would begin to carve out a new branch of science, anatomy. But in order to do so, you need some bodies to cut open to start slopping their guts around. And what better way to obtain fresh bodies than to use condemned criminals, captured and supplied by the Alexandrian rulers. Little Hero and Era were like kids in a candy store with a hopeful glimmer in their eyes, excited to begin their wondrous experiments. But surely the criminals put under the knife were already past their expiration date, right? Nope. Instead, Hero and Era performed live human dissections, called vivisections, to broaden their understanding of the human body. They even went as far as to perform these surgeries in full view of the public for anyone who thought it would be cool and interesting. Wow, that's both cool and interesting. That's what I'm saying! Herophilus documented their findings in extreme detail, making breakthrough discoveries of the human anatomy. In doing so, he inflicted unimaginable suffering to his subjects. Since anesthetics weren't really a thing back then, the victims felt every cut and slice, at least until they passed out from the pain or died of blood loss. Dissecting intestines, reproductive organs, eyes, or even purposefully damaging the motor nerves to inflict paralysis. It was basically a big game of, what does this button do? In the end, Hero and Era's findings over 40 years of vivisections were revolutionary for the medical world, especially since human dissection would be outlawed shortly after their work was completed. It wouldn't be until 1800 years later that performing human dissections would be a medically acceptable practice again. But like, on dead people? Their work was stored in the renowned Library of Alexandria, but they were lost in the Great Fire a few hundred years later. Project 4.1 was actually a side project proposed immediately after the deployment of Castle Bravo, a high-yield thermonuclear bomb that was dropped in 1954 by the United States. Bravo was part of Operation Castle, a series of other high-yield nuclear tests with the goal of establishing superiority over the Soviet Union. The Marshall Islands, a remote Pacific group of islands, served as ground zero for the detonation of the nuclear weapons. Castle Bravo was the strongest detonation and surprisingly produced 2.5 times the expected explosive yield, resulting in an explosive force equivalent to 15 megatons of TNT. To put that into perspective, that is 1,000 times the explosive force of the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan in the final days of World War II. Like, goddamn. To make matters worse, the Marshall Islands were occupied with citizens. So US officials were kind of like, sir, shouldn't we get those people out of the...
Bless you.
Thanks, sir. Allergies have been bothering me all day. Must be the radiation, right? No, but seriously, are we gonna get those people out of the radiation zone?
Yeah, that was on my to-do list. Well, too late now, so let's just see how things turn out.
Operation Castle was quickly amended with the addition of Project 4.1. This new section aimed to study the human response to significant radiation exposure. As if tens of thousands of victims in Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't evidence enough. Commander of the U.S. Naval Medical Corps, Eugene Cronkite, was in charge of the project and swore everyone involved to absolute secrecy because he thought the public wouldn't be too keen on the whole test nuclear radiation on non-consenting people thing. Overall, 239 Marshallese residents were exposed to significant levels of radiation and began showing signs of radiation poisoning a few days later. Symptoms included loss of hair and significant skin damage with weeping wounds, although the wounds did heal rather quickly. Immediate observations ceased after 75 days with the conclusion that no long-term effects were likely. But just out of curiosity, regular checkups were performed on the residents for years after. Women saw increases in miscarriages and stillbirths, and newborns that survived experienced developmental difficulties, impaired growth, and a disproportionate development of thyroid cancer. In addition, about 1/3 of those exposed had developed significant tumors by 1974, 20 years after Operation Castle commenced. In the following years, Marshallese representatives spoke out against the United States, with accusations that the scope of the experiment was premeditated and intentional, to which the US officials responded, "Nuh-uh." During the early years of the Soviet Union, it wouldn't be uncommon for political opponents to quickly fall ill with a strong case of the death at the hands of poison. In fact, it was quite an effective and discreet way to silence any and all opposition without causing too much of a stir. Well, besides the public reacting to mysterious deaths. And that is why we must rise up against... Oh, look at that. They got another one. So how were the Soviets so good at developing successful poisons? Well, you've got to run preliminary trials on living subjects, of course. So in 1921, a year before the Soviet Union officially formed, the Kamera was established. This was the Soviet Secret Service's poison laboratory. Here, new deadly poisons were developed and tested on human subjects. Those tested were prisoners from the gulags, various labor camps built around the country for anyone who even had a fleeting thought that wasn't approved by the Soviet Union. Carry on. The ultimate goal of the Kamera was to devise a poison that was not only lethal, but undetectable. It would be colorless, tasteless, odorless, and untraceable in an autopsy. Prisoners would be unknowingly administered various test poisons, which were disguised as medication. For me, if it isn't an orange Flintstone vitamin, I don't trust it. The various poisons tested included ricin, which causes severe internal distress and suffering, cyanide, which can cause violent seizures and heart attacks, and curare, a potent muscle relaxant that makes you painfully choke to death. In the end, the tests were pretty successful. For the Soviet Union, not for the prisoners. Research led to innovative ways to discreetly dispatch a target, from deploying a cyanide mist to making an assassination look like a heart attack. But the blue ribbon winner was the concoction known as C2, carbolamine choline chloride, which was basically liquid depression. Exposure to this sucker sparked a very curious reaction. Instead of a violent telltale "I've been poisoned" type death, the victim would simply become weak with a rapid decline in health, all while maintaining a calm and silent demeanor. Death occurred within 15 minutes. Since the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian officials have claimed that the Kamera has been disestablished and abandoned. Yeah, sure. Now, you may have heard about the Tuskegee syphilis study, which was an unethical medical study funded by the United States Public Health Service in 1932, which involved the study of nearly 400 African American men who had naturally contracted syphilis. The goal was to observe the effects of the disease when left untreated in African American males. Even though penicillin, an antibiotic cure for syphilis, eventually became widely available to the public, the afflicted men were intentionally never cured. Fucked up, right? Well, the US decided to outdo themselves with the Guatemalan syphilis experiment. In 1946 to 1948, more than 5,500 Guatemalan natives, including children, were involved in the experiment against their will, with the Guatemalan government granting access to the unwilling patients in hospitals, mental institutions, and even orphanages. Around 1,300 relatively healthy individuals ages 10 to 72 were intentionally infected with syphilis and even gonorrhea. Transmission was either done by direct bacterial contact into wounds or by sexual transmission with infected native sex workers, which were funded by the US government, by the way. The latter of which proved to be a very effective method of infection. The guy in charge of these experiments was Dr. John C. Cutler, but you can call him Dr. Dickass. He often failed to keep accurate medical records of his experiments and instead would only provide anecdotal evidence in his findings, probably because he knew what he was doing was unethical, which very much sounds like something only a dickass would do. But all joking aside, the experiments conducted on these people were gruesome. Perhaps one of the most notable documented examples of what these people experienced was about a female patient named Berta. The following is an excerpt from that document. Berta was a female patient in the psychiatric hospital. In February 1948, Berta was injected in her left arm with syphilis. A month later, she developed scabies. Several weeks later, Dr. Cutler noted that she had also developed red bumps where he had injected her arm, lesions on her arms and legs, and her skin was beginning to waste away from her body. Berta was not treated for syphilis until 3 months after her injection. Soon after, on August 23rd, Dr. Cutler wrote that Berta appeared as if she was going to die, but he did not specify why. That same day, he put gonorrheal pus from another male subject into both of Berta's eyes, as well as her private areas. He also reinfected her with syphilis. Several days later, Berta's eyes were filled with pus from the gonorrhea, and she was bleeding from her private area. 3 days later, on August 27th, Berta died. Told you he was a dick-ass. The overall goal of the study was to determine the effectiveness of penicillin in preventing the STDs. Dr. Cutler had allegedly finalized his reports in 1955, but no evidence was ever found proving that the reports were submitted for peer review or even published. So, out of all of that suffering, nothing of medical value was produced. Though, I will say in some glimmer of fairness, a treatment program was established by the United States and made available to the affected Guatemalan population, but only half were reported to actually have received treatments with a questionable quality of care. United States President Barack Obama formally apologized to the Guatemalan government in 2010, 62 years after the study was performed. Yeah, that last one was quite the doozy, huh? Well, buckle up because it's about to get way worse. See this right here? This is Unit 731. It was home to some of the most notorious and truly evil war crimes committed by the Japanese in World War II, which are definitely up there with some of the worst in the history of mankind. Unit 731 served as a lethal human experimentation and biological weapons laboratory during the Second Sino-Japanese War between China and Japan, which ran concurrent to most of the events of World War II. This nightmare facility was established in 1935 in the sub-provincial Chinese city of Harbin, 4 years after Japanese forces invaded the Chinese region of Manchuria. Inside, hundreds of thousands of Chinese and even some Russian prisoners of war were subjected to some of the most egregious and horrifying human experimentations known to man. Experiments performed on men, women, and children, which is everyone. Those chosen for experimentation were dehumanized and referred to as maruta, or logs, rather than as people, because the cover-up story for Unit 731 was that it was a lumber mill. It should be noted that the vast majority of the experiments in the facility were carried out to fulfill morbid curiosity, with those performing or overseeing the studies described as merely playing. A testimony from a Japanese professor who witnessed the studies was quoted saying that some of the experiments had nothing to do with advancing the capability of germ warfare, or of medicine. There is such a thing as professional curiosity. What would happen if we did such and such? What medical purpose was served by performing and studying beheadings? None at all. That was just playing around. Professional people, too, like to play. So basically experiments were like, I wonder what would happen if we just hucked a grenade at a guy. Bang. Oh look, he exploded. Hey, can I go home now? Gee, I wonder if this large heavy object will crush this guy. Yup. Will this guy freeze to death if I freeze him to death? Wow, who would have guessed? A lot of these experiments were designed to test the absolute limits of the human body. Tests included depriving victims of food or water to see how long they could survive, placing victims in low-pressure chambers until their eyes popped from their skulls, injecting victims with animal blood, hanging victims upside down until death, or even draining victims of blood just to study blood loss limits. Some victims were even dehydrated in front of large hot fans to the point of mummification. At the time of death, they only weighed 20% of their initial body weight. Perhaps one of the worst examples I've read was the forced pregnancy of female victims. The mothers were injected with various diseases and drugs just to see how they affected the unborn child, sometimes performing a vivisection, cutting the fetus out of the mother for examination. There's honestly so many more gruesome experiments that I just can't get into here, so if you are curious, I would encourage you to look them up. But it's like legit really bad, so you've been warned. By the end of the war, as Soviet forces were closing in, Japanese officials had all remaining prisoners executed and the entirety of Unit 731 hastily demolished to destroy any remaining evidence of the program's existence. The United States had discovered trace evidence and pressured Japanese officials into spilling the beans, under threat that they would be handed over to Soviet officials for trial and punishment if they did not cooperate. Once the US learned the full extent of the horrors of Unit 731, all of those involved were swiftly brought to trial and executed for their crimes. Except, no, they actually weren't. In reality, the United States claimed that the data collected from the inhumane atrocities was actually pretty valuable, since it is otherwise ethically unobtainable through conventional means. As such, many of those involved were granted immunity and freedom in exchange for the data. The deal was struck, and the United States kept everything under lock and key. The Soviet Union, however, pursued trials against the top military leaders and scientists from Unit 731. In the end, only 12 individuals were tried and sentenced to several years in labor camps, although the United States repeatedly denied that Unit 731 ever existed. Human sacrifice is a noble tradition that has been going on since the dawn of civilization. Whether it's to make your king happy, appease the gods, or just a creative way of getting rid of an annoying neighbor, you can bet that a classic heart-stealing, skull-splitting sacrifice will get the job done. So let's take a look at how different societies used to willingly depopulate themselves for the greater good. Imagine you spend most, if not all of your life serving one guy. The Pharaoh. Well, one day he just keels over from choking on a scarab and you say to yourself, oh thank God, your years of servitude are over. Only to find out that the Pharaoh handpicked you and your buddies to serve him in the afterlife. To make matters worse, you look around to see all of your bros celebrating like Ra himself just showed up to the party. Are you fucking kidding me? You say to yourself as a sword is rammed into your delicate tummy. Your body is then mummified and you're entombed with Pharaoh and the boys for all eternity. This is basically how retainer sacrifices went. Since pharaohs were seen as gods in human form, they were treated as such, requiring countless servants to tend to their every need. Like a lot of civilizations, ancient Egyptians believed in an afterlife where you could continue to do what you do without the fragility of mortality. Of course, pharaohs didn't want to spend eternity having to do things themselves. That's for poor people. So there were instances where pharaohs would arrange to have servants or even close family members sacrifice to accompany them into the next life. Evidence shows that those chosen for eternal untipped servitude willingly gave their lives as a sign of everlasting devotion to their pharaoh. Dumbasses. Examination of the bodies showed no signs of struggle or trauma, suggesting that they most likely cast themselves into the shadow realm sipping on an arsenic brewski. Retainer sacrifices were rare, and some of the only evidence of its practice dates back to the first dynasty of Egypt around 3000 BC, but it has also been seen in other ancient cultures like Sumerians and Chinese, though the practice seemed to have faded in popularity as time went on. My guess is the pool for volunteers dried up once they realized they could just be like, yeah, sure Pharaoh, we'll be right behind you. Wink. Imagine you take the time to build a nice bridge to cross a pesky river. That's a nice bridge right there. But it suddenly gets washed away by a rush of water because rivers, am I right? Oh toots, you say, slapping your knee, but you don't let it get you down just yet. You can rebuild, and so you do, but damn it! Looks like something really doesn't want you building a bridge there. The gods? A nature spirit? Poor structural integrity from a lack of engineering experience? Whatever the case, you're left with no choice. You have to reliably cross that river. It's time to start sacrificing! Japan is no stranger to odd practices to appease spirits, and hitobashira is one of them. Translating to human pillar, the practice was used to basically bless new construction projects with good fortune. Dang, this project is 3 weeks behind schedule. Well, in you go, Martha. Sir, the budgets have just been coincidentally increased. It's a miracle! It was a common belief that disturbing the earth for means of construction would piss off the local spirits around the land, cursing the structure to an untimely demise. Well, that's not so great for the portfolio's ROI, so builders needed some insurance that their castles and bridges were going to at least have a few centuries of durability against some spooky specters. Victims, or volunteers, would be handpicked to sacrifice themselves to serve this greater purpose. In their sacrifice, they would become a guardian spirit for the structure, protecting it from natural elements or enemy attacks. To be honest, I'd give up my life so a Denny's could serve for all eternity. Famous sites that use some human reinforcement are the Maruoka Castle in Sakai and the Matsuejo Castle in Matsue. Those being sacrificed would be provided a small, comfy hole in which to be buried alive, forever entombed under or near the new construction. The practice was common up until the 16th century when people started to realize, yeah, that makes no sense, and declared it inhumane. Although there is evidence that the practice continued up to the 20th century. I guess some traditions just don't die, but the people do. Mayans. Probably the first thing you think of when you hear human sacrifice in your everyday conversations. Decapitation, ripping out hearts, throwing people in pits, they had it all. Dating as far back as 250 AD, the Mayan people were big on human sacrifice as an ultimate offering to the gods if they really wanted something dire, be it fertility to save them from famine, or rainfall to save them from drought. The unfortunate thing is that droughts and famine eventually subside naturally, so the Mayans never got a good feedback loop that their sacrifices were in vain. They really just kept doing it until their problems were solved, and to their credit, there was definitely no lack of imagination on how to lower their population density either. Those eligible for the privilege of getting sliced and diced onto the village charcuterie board were typically high-value prisoners of war from rival societies, as they were seen as a better offering to the gods. These smelly, unpopular captives would typically be forced into labor, building all of the structures that their friends just died for. Oh yeah, ritualistic offerings were also performed for things like new construction or appointing a new ruler. Nothing like breaking ground by shoving the shovel into your buddy's skull. Thanks, gods. The main goal of sacrifice was to extract blood from their victims as tribute. Of course, getting your sacrifice to bleed was the easy part, but Mayans like to put on a good show. Lobbing heads off, ripping their still beating hearts from their chests, and chucking their bodies down a bunch of steps, slamming numerous arrows into their chests, simple cutting and draining, all very effective at getting that sweet red good out from their bodies. The blood was often smeared across images of the gods that they wished to appease, with the remaining blood and corpsey bits burned to complete the tribute. In case you were wondering, Aztecs performed very similar sacrifices, though a bit more grand. For example, during the reconsecration of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan, it is estimated that more than 80,000 prisoners were sacrificed, reducing crime rate 143% overnight. Even though we are grateful every day for the invention of olive oil, Greece has a pretty dark history. When times were looking grim thanks to the usual suspects of famine, war, or plague, it was deemed necessary to make a sacrifice to purify the community. Roughly translating to scapegoat, pharmakos was the ritualistic sacrifice or exile of a person or group of people. Those typically chosen for the task were slaves, cripples, or criminals. You could even be chosen if you were just plain ugly. Those people were seen as impure and a blight on their society, thus causing all of the misfortunes. Tomatoes not growing right? Just blame Nasty Nick down the road. Yeah, he's guilty. The ritual can go one of two ways. Either the victim is completely sacrificed, or is just exiled. Typically, full-on sacrifice was reserved for the worst of criminals, where they could just be thrown off a cliff into the sea or burned on a pyre. Although it has to be said that many modern history dorks say this probably never happened, so who knows? There are stories from Athens that each year during a harvest festival called Thargelia, the ugliest man and woman would be well fed and paraded through the city. This is nice. But then they would just get absolutely demolished with sticks and branches and kicked out of the city. Well, that's what you get for ruining my tomatoes. Marriage can be one of the happiest moments in a person's life. You dedicate the rest of your life ensuring prosperity, safety, and care for your partner. But what happens once till death do you part becomes reality? Why, you sacrifice yourself, of course. Back around 320 AD, Hindu women would often opt into the practice of sati, in which they would sacrifice themselves to the funeral pyre of their recently deceased husbands. This was seen as an ultimate sacrifice and a sign of utmost devotion as they would follow their loved ones into the spirit world. The grieving widows would either softly lay next to their dearly departed or 720 laser flip their way onto the funeral pyre as it burned, which was pretty metal. As time went on, women became a little bit more reluctant to just throwing themselves willy-nilly into fire because, maybe they wanted to live instead? But thanks to good old societal pressures, these women were more or less forced to the flame. Widows who had no children were seen as nothing but a burden on society since they could not remarry and therefore had no further use. According to a website I found when researching this, the practice of sati was highest between the 15th and 18th centuries, with as many as 1,000 widows blazing it each year. I mean, I've heard of hot single women in my area, but this is ridiculous. Thankfully, the practice was officially banned in 1829. So there you have it. Societies have gone through a lot of sacrifices throughout history and still do even today. For example, I sacrifice my time making these videos trying to convince you that I'm funny, and you sacrifice your time confirming that I'm not. But hey, that's showbiz, baby. Evil kings doing evil things. again. It's always a roll of the dice when slapping a quivering child on the throne. Will they mature into a fair and caring leader, or will they go goo goo gaga bonkers and tear the country asunder? Well, it really depends on whoever raises them. For the case of young Charles IX, he was screwed from the get-go. Born in the Saint-Germain-en-Laye commune in north-central France back in old 1550, young Chuck had a lot to look forward to. He was the prince after all. Surely once his dear old dad had passed at a reasonably old age after bequeathing decades of knowledge and wisdom to his growing boy, Charles would do well to carry on that legacy. It's just too bad that Chuck's dad, Henry II, caught a honkin' hunk of splintered wood in his eyeball during a jousting tournament and died from an infection. Quite an embarrassing death, wouldn't you agree? But an embarrassing death is a death nonetheless, so for a reign to progress, a prince must acquiesce his distress and take to the throne with success. After his older brother died, of course. There we go. Now up to bat, Charles took the throne in 1560. The mathematically astute among you will realize that in 1560, the new monarch would be only 10. And you're correct. The compact little croissant was now king, but he couldn't reign his way out of a cloud. So until Charles came of age, the big britches of power were instead passed on to his mother, Catherine de' Medici, and she had plans of her own. It's important to acknowledge that during this time in France, there was a lot of religious squabbling, mainly between Catholics and Protestants. They both believe in the same God, sure, it's just that their teachings are slightly different, but different enough to kill each other. The Catholics were in the majority, with the Protestants, mainly a subsect called the Huguenots, being the persecuted rebellious few, making up about 10% of France's population. With ongoing violence slowly escalating over the years, Catherine proposed the Edict of January, basically stating, "Alright, we'll tolerate y'all, but cut the shit, behave yourselves, and follow the rules." But the more committed Catholics of the French government weren't too pleased with, at the very least, putting up with all of these heretical Protestants. One such outraged individual was Francis, Duke of Guise. He already had a bad experience with the Huguenots, having recently uncovered a plot to have him removed from power. His resulting rage culminated in the massacre of Vassy, where the aforementioned Duke found a stronghold of worshipping Huguenots gathered in a church on his land. So he killed a bunch of them. This event kicked off the first of several religious wars in France. But what does all of this have to do with Charles? Well, during the years of the on and off wars between the Catholics and the Protestants, Charles became a target. He had avoided assassination and abduction attempts from the Huguenots, making it harder for the king to empathize with them. After turning 13, Charles declared himself old enough to rule on his own, granting himself full authority, though he remained heavily influenced by Mama Medici. With thousands of his own people dead and royal coffers running dry, Charles needed to end these wars once and for all. So he hatched a plan. He had arranged the marriage between his very Catholic sister Margaret and devout Huguenot leader Henry of Navarre as an act of good faith and a final peace offering. The most wealthy and influential of the Huguenot leaders flocked to witness the wedding, but many would not make it home. With growing concerns and paranoia surrounding the influx of Huguenot leaders, Charles and his mother feared that a rebellion was on the horizon. So, on August 22nd, 1572, under the influence of his mother, Charles ordered the execution of Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, one of the main Huguenot leaders in town.
Mind your own business!
This murder sparked the infamous Bartholomew's Day Massacre, a systematic slaughtering of thousands of Huguenots within Paris. Homes and shops were raided, pillaged, and destroyed, and bodies were disrespectfully dumped in the Seine. Wanting to take advantage of the uprising as a way to strangle any remaining life of the Huguenots' power once and for all, some historians believe that Charles pushed for the violence to extend beyond the city, despite calling for an end to the violence a few days later to save face. Over the course of the next several weeks, tens of thousands of Huguenots were executed. The massacre, however, had the opposite effect. Unsurprisingly, the Protestants were now properly pissed off, initiating more religious wars that would last for another 26 years. King Charles would never live to see peace. The aftermath of the massacre drove the young king insane, shifting between bouts of boasting and remorse. One day he would be bragging about the extremity of the brutal bloodshed, while the next he claimed to be haunted by the screams of his victims. His mental health got flushed down the shitter as he constantly expressed immense grief over the incident. It also didn't help that Mama Medici made her son feel worse, giving him the full blame and declaring him a raving lunatic. In his now vulnerable and weakened state, the young king contracted tuberculosis in spring of 1574. King Charles IX coughed himself into the great beyond a few months later at the age of 23. Now, when you have a damning title like The Cruel, which admittedly is badass in and of itself, it's most likely one that was earned through various acts of ferocity, or just being a downright dick. So let's take a look at what Peter I of Castile did to obtain it. Born in 1334, the pint-sized Peter Pokemon evolved into a 6-foot-tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, chiseled chap. A hard worker and well-educated, the young prince had the qualifications to become a great leader, but he was being led by a bad example: his father. Daddy Alfonso XI was a ruthless king, but in that day and age, you kinda had to be. If you're too lenient, you're gonna get steamrolled by your enemies, but if you're too tyrannical, you're gonna catch a knife between your blades. Power! Alfonso, a man of strategy, worked tirelessly to expand his kingdom, arresting and executing any and all political opponents, often without trial. So it's pretty obvious where Peter's future policies may have been influenced. In 1350, King Alfonso XI himself caught an influential case of the Black Plague, which was ravaging Europe at the time, and ultimately dissolved from the throne, leaving it open to Peter. The determined prince donned the crown and became king of the Iberian kingdoms of Castile and Leon that same year. But it wasn't exactly a peaceful transition. Alfonso had a mistress who shot out multiple sons, half-brothers to Peter who wanted the throne for themselves, one in particular being Enrique. But we'll get to that later. King Peter was just 16 at the time of his crowning, so he sometimes took political advice from his still-alive mother. One such piece of advice was marrying the alliterative 14-year-old Blanche of Bourbon in 1353. Do you, King Peter, take Blanche to be your wife for life? Clearly not thrilled with this venture, Peter, just 2 days after marriage, abandoned Blanche for his side chick and ultimate love interest, Maria de Padilla, with whom he married in secret before Bland asked Blanche. They had 4 babies together. Yeah, that's how it works. As for Blanche, it's actually kind of a sad story. Peter not only abandoned her, but had her imprisoned in a town near the southernmost point of the Iberian Peninsula, far away from the kingdom. Though she was briefly a queen, Blanche died in captivity in 1361 under mysterious circumstances. Some historians believe that she was either poisoned or caught a crossbow bolt in the skull under Peter's command, though this is debated. Pretty cruel if you ask me. However, during his reign, Peter also earned the title of Peter the Just from his supporters. The king had attempted to centralize power away from wealthy nobles, giving platform to commoners and minority populations, particularly Jews and Muslims. The nobles, unsurprisingly, did not like that one bit. But since the king was king and all, any nobles who felt particularly rebellious or treasonous were given a peaceful view of the horizon, from a hanging rope. This trouble and turmoil among the ranks inspired a desire for someone to overthrow the crazed king. And who should show up but the various half-brothers from before? After many rebellions staged by said half-brothers, Peter captured and executed them all, including their mother. One brother was reportedly hacked to pieces as Peter looked on with a shit-eating grin. However, one brother managed to escape. Enrique evaded capture and fled to France, where he started to gather allies under French King John II. This caught the attention of another Peter, Peter of the neighboring kingdom of Aragon. Thus began the War of the Two Peters in 1356. Castile proceeded to kick Aragon's shit in, but Aragon had an ace up its sleeve. Yup, he was back. And now he was also backed by Aragon and the French. Enrique infiltrated Castile and actually managed to dethrone Peter, who ran away to England for backup in order to exact revenge, which he did. Peter regained his throne after the Battle of Nájera in 1367, but he failed to properly thank and pay tribute to the English for their help. Bad move. Now back at the helm, Peter systematically tortured and executed any and all nobles whom he deemed supportive of Enrique, oftentimes without proof. Peter lived in pure paranoia for the next few years, failing to trust any advisors or nobles, leading to a collapse in political power. Seeing the perfect opportunity for a critical final strike, Enrique attacked once more with the Battle of Montiel in March of 1390. Peter was defeated and was stabbed in the freaking face with a knife by his half-brother, who finally took the throne for good, until he died of heart failure a decade later. In Chinese history, Di Xin of the Shang dynasty is a textbook example of how greed, corruption, and tyranny can twist a leader into moral depravity. After his death, Di Xin was given the posthumous title of King Zhou, with Zhou being the name of the part of a saddle that wraps around a horse's tail and brushes along its butthole. That's a rather creative insult, so you know this guy messed up something awful. Now, being an ancient king and all, historians are forced to rely on often very heavily exaggerated and embellished stories and legends, so for this chapter, take what you will with a grain of salt. Also, forgive my pronunciations. And also subscribe. Alright. King Butthole Strap began his reign in 1075 BC. According to ancient Chinese historian Sima Qian, the king was an exceptionally gifted fella, able to outsmart any opponent and strong enough to successfully hunt with nothing more than his bare hands. Doubtful, but whatever. Paired up with his favorite consort, the lovely and sadistic Da Qi, the two became a powerhouse of torture and torment for those unfortunate enough to be in their vicinity. Although remembered as a competent strategist, able to expand his empire through military campaigns, the king was blinded by his infatuation with Da Qi and drained the kingdom's coffers on extravagance. He was the king, and he truly wanted to live like one. According to legend, King Zhou would stop at nothing to fulfill the wishes of Da Qi, going as far as to build an elaborate palace garden crammed full of rare and exotic animals. Well, that's not too bad, you might say, with a bit of drool on your chin. Well, how about forcing royal subjects to drink from a freshly dug out wine pond or eat meat from hanging tree limbs? Oh yeah, they were all naked too. Where's all the hanging meat? I think I found it. These breezy brunches, along with any other over-the-top nonsensical nonsense, was funded solely by the taxpayers, which pissed them off.
You stupid!
The king's public support was nearly non-existent. It's just too bad that any outspoken individuals were subject to immediate imprisonment and torture. One such torture was the roasting beam, an invention of the king's own design. A long, hollow bronze beam positioned over a roaring fire. The roasting beam was stuffed with searing hot coals, transferring their heat to the highly thermoconductive bronze. The king would also take the time to grease up his long pole. According to legend, King Zhou had forced prisoners to walk across the pole, promising release if they were successful. They weren't. An alternate version of this torture device was flipped 90 degrees, a bronze column to which the victim was chained while a fire roared beneath them, cooking the victim to a delicate medium rare. You know, firm, but with a little give. The king and his main squeeze would reportedly revel in the pain inflicted on their prisoners, seeing the torment as pure cinema. Now, when you live life in excess and are tyrannical and maniacal dickbags to your starving and suffering subjects, it's pretty easy to understand that said subjects are going to want to murder you. Like, passionately murder you. King Zhou's relatives begged him to change his ways and shift towards a noble and kind rule. He would not be persuaded. At least, not until this handsome bag of biscuits showed up. This is Chifa of Zhou. Now, to clear some things up here, Zhou is not Zhou. This is Zhou. This is Zhou. Different inflection, different words. I don't know, man. The Chinese language is complicated. While evil-ass King Zhou was getting his rocks off watching dudes burn, Chifa was gathering an army. Refusing to be threatened, the king answered the call of war in the Battle of Moye in 1046 BC, but ultimately got his metaphorical socks knocked off so hard that he faced defeat. The greedy king then retreated into his palace, surrounded himself with his treasures, and, symbolic of the gilded dumpster fire that was his reign, set everything, including himself, ablaze at the age of 59. Da Qi, hearing of her beloved king's death, logged out of the server by strangling herself. Da Qi was ultimately blamed for the king's erratic behavior, believed by many to have been possessed by a demonic nine-tailed fox spirit, Naruto style. And thus, with the death of King Zhou, the Zhou dynasty came into power. How about that? The word terrible is tossed around like a frisbee at a blind picnic. So much so that it's lost its original meaning. Like the word literally. Sure, terrible can mean something exceptionally bad, but it also means something that instills terror or is sinister in nature, in essence, of pure evil. See, there's a difference between, ugh, this is terrible, and which is why Ivan was named as such, making for a terrible yet shareable parable. Continuing the trend in this video, Ivan began his reign young, being only 16 when crowned Tsar of all Russia in 1547. His early years as ruler were actually pretty peaceful and progressive. The Tsar had revised law code, established a standing army, and granted the rights of self-government to rural regions. But in 1553, Ivan was stricken with a near-fatal illness. Weak and weary on his deathbed, Ivan requested that his closest nobles swear allegiance to his son in the event of his death.
Please, my son.
I require many soggy oats.
What the fuck is that thing? They refused. This prompted Ivan to enact his plan B. Ivan's health eventually recovered, unlike his trust in his supposedly loyal nobles. The Tsar pushed to expand Russian territory with the hope of opening up opportunistic trade routes. Naturally, this instigated several battles of territorial control. Ivan saw many a success, but each at a deep cost of Russian resources. And then in 1558 came the Livonian War, a war aimed at taking control of Old Livonia, which would grant Russia much-needed access to the Baltic Sea. Facing off against the kingdoms of Sweden and Poland, along with Lithuania and other European strengths, Russia was devastated. The cost of this war threw the country into economic ruin, and it was only downhill from there for poor Ivan. Famine and drought ravaged the land, his friggin' wife died, and various betrayals caused the Tsar to spiral into a manic depression, even going as far as writing a letter of resignation from the throne. The nobles, terrified to rule the country themselves, begged for Ivan's return, which he agreed, but on one condition. He would be granted absolute power over every aspect of the country, including, and most importantly, the right to execute any traitors of the crown. They hesitantly agreed. Thus, Ivan returned to power with a tight, unrelenting grip. He immediately established the Oprichniki, his very own personal guard. In exchange for wealth and privilege, these soldiers were Ivan's eyes and ears around the country, given the job of sniffing out any potential disloyalty. That great power remained completely unchecked. Under Ivan's rule, they executed and exiled thousands of nobles, seized their land, and harshly oppressed peasants. And things only got worse. By 1570, the iconic plague, TM, tore through the country, killing thousands by the day. Novgorod, one of Russia's most prominent cities, was crippled by plague, famine, and Ivan's ruthless rulings. Ivan himself feared that the entire city would defect to Lithuania, because yeah, that Livonian War was still going on during all of this, and so he decided to make a preemptive strike. In January of 1570, Ivan's Oprichniki invaded the city and began their reign of terror. Those attempting to escape found it impossible, as Ivan's forces had barricaded the city. They were trapped. Captives were tortured for information about their supposed plans for the betrayal of the crown, but none could speak of a truth that didn't exist. Citizens were either burned alive or tied up and thrown into the freezing river, suffocating under the ice. Farms surrounding the city were completely destroyed, condemning any already starving survivors to death without any possible sustenance. By the end of the massacre a few weeks later, thousands of people lay dead in Ivan's wake. Any and all valuables from homes, shops, and churches were stripped, taken back to Ivan's home in Moscow, and divided amongst the Oprichniki soldiers. The Tsar's brutality had truly hit an apex, but it would soon hit a bit too close to home. On November 16, 1581, Ivan got in a heated argument with his 27-year-old son after having savagely beaten his pregnant daughter-in-law Yelena for being inappropriately dressed. The father-son altercation quickly rose to a boiling point, and Ivan lashed out, striking a single fatal blow across his son's head with a heavy cane. He had killed his own son. Worse yet, Yelena miscarried just hours later due to her injuries. Ivan collapsed to the ground, a broken man, holding his son's corpse. Before him flashed his own life of desolation and despair. After the incident, Ivan became remorseful for his past actions. In his final years, the Tsar had agreed to a truce with Lithuania, finally ending the 24-year-long Livonian War. He tied up all loose ends and made peace with himself, but this didn't stop his physical deterioration. By 1584, Tsar Ivan was a frail man. Although only 53, decades of physical and mental anguish destroyed his body and mind, not to mention long-term effects from mercury addiction. On March 28, 1584, Ivan suffered a stroke and died while playing a game of chess, causing 2 kings to fall at once. The most painful punishments from around the world. Well, of course the Spaniards are going to be on this list. Them suckers tortured half-truths out of people for over 350 years during the highly unexpected Spanish Inquisition between 1478 up until 1834. Now, when you're performing painful public persecutions for such a long time, you're going to come up with pretty colorful ways to do it. Ways to inflict maximum pain to ensure that you extract those dubious confessions from those filthy non-Catholic heathens. So it's no wonder that history was blessed with devilish devices designed to do just that. You had the Spanish spider, the Spanish collar, the Spanish tickler, very different from the French variety, the Spanish donkey, and the star of this segment, the Spanish boot. Originating somewhere during the Inquisition times, the Spanish boot was a very basic, yet very effective interrogation tool. Help. 4 planks of wood and a few bits of metal. You got your braces for holding the wooden splints and sharpened metal nails to make you squint. The legs of the victim would be secured in place between the 2 inner free-moving braces. The 2 outer planks are secured to each other, preventing any outward movement. Not that you would want to, because, you know, sharp nails and such. Once the victim was sat down, a large wooden wedge would be placed in between the inner planks, locking the victim's legs. And I'm sure your imagination is a few steps ahead here. The interrogator equips his iconic giant hammer and rears back, preparing to strike. Are you sure you don't want to confess your crimes? Because this pulsating sack of meat is about to treat you like one of them carnival tests of strength. With one swift blow from the hammer, the wedge drives the inner boards outwards, lacerating your legs, shattering your shins, and crushing your calves. The pain is pure agony. And that was only the first strike. Additional slams from the mallet reduce your legs down to something resembling burger meat. Remember when you could walk like 30 seconds ago? Yeah, me too. Now, despite the Iberian identity, there were many variations of the Spanish boot throughout history. The Scottish first dabbled in boot torture even before the Spanish, tightly binding victims' legs in saturated leather. The bindings would then be heated over an open fire, shrinking the leather and constricting the legs to the point of snapping bone. The French even got in on the action with their own version. The victim would be bound and gagged on a wooden chair with both feet placed in a single oversized iron boot. It would then be filled with either boiling water, boiling oil, or even molten lead. And if you're unaware, pure lead melts at around 622 degrees Fahrenheit or 328 degrees Celsius. For comparison, just 2 seconds of exposure to 150 degree Fahrenheit water is enough to cause third-degree burns on human skin. Victims of the French boot would have their skin and their muscles boiled off of their bones or encased in a big hunk of lead. Better get to confessing, or at least make up something convincing. Oh, this shit sucks. You ever hear the term an eye for an eye? Well, the literal form of this would be the toe-curling, face-scrunching practice of abacination. Popular amongst ancient Greeks, Persians, and within the Byzantine Empire, abacination is a form of corporal punishment, meaning that the goal isn't death, but rather to teach the victim a lesson. In this case, how not to see anymore. That's because abacination is the act of inflicting intentional or oftentimes irreversible damage to one's eyeballs. Hey. What the fuck? Your bulbous oculi have a myriad of nerves ready to send your brain big ouch signals the moment they detect discomfort. And boy, are they about to feel some discomfort. Although it was mainly used as a punishment for heresy or treason, the act of annihilating one's eyes existed all across human history. Perhaps one of the most popular examples of this was executed by Byzantine Emperor Basil II. After defeating the Bulgarians at the Battle of Cladion, Big Bad Basil had taken thousands of enemy soldiers hostage. He had ordered that the men be divided into groups of 100 and brought before him. It was then he had his men gouge out the eyes of 99 of the soldiers, sparing one who would be allowed to keep one eye. That lucky duck would be the one to lead his now blinded comrades back to their respective commanders. Now, according to legend, this mass blinding was conducted on 15,000 men, granting Basil II the vicious title of Basil the Bulgar Slayer. But how would this blinding actually be performed? Well, it's really up to how the person doing it felt that day. Traditionally, a bassination was carried out by jamming a red-hot iron rod into the ocular cavity, essentially melting the eye from the skull. Other flavors of removal included scooping with a spoon-like device, slitting with a blade, using preposterous pressure to pop them like pimples, or just leaving it up to good old chemistry. Now, if you really pissed someone off, you would be strapped to a chair while corrosive liquid, usually boiling vinegar, was placed in soluble cups and positioned over your eyes. The corrosive agents would slowly eat away at the bottom of the cups, left to drip into your eyeballs, which would painfully dissolve away. At that point, you'd be luckier to die than to survive. But couldn't they just close their eyelids? Oh, you mean these? Yeah, they cut those off too. Don't worry, it was only a little painful. See what I did there? No, you didn't. That's fine. Strap in for this one, cause that's exactly what's about to go down, and your legs are about to go up. This is the Tiger Bench, a Chinese torture device popularly used in China from the Imperial Age up through today. That's right, the International Society for Human Rights, a German-based non-governmental non-profit organization, claims that multiple inhumane torture devices like the Tiger Bench are still used on prisoners in China to this day for extracting confessions or flat-out torture just because. It's true, probably. And the same applied to its use in the Imperial Age. During the times of the Ming and Qing dynasties between the 14th and 20th centuries, the judicial system required a confession to legally convict a criminal for their crimes, since forensics at the time weren't all that great. Unless you had notable status to sway public opinion, the perpetrator would basically have to be caught red-handed by multiple witnesses. He ran into my knife. He ran into my knife 10 times. He had it coming. But what do Tiger Bench do, you ask in poor English? It's very simple. The victim is delicately slammed onto a wooden bench in a sitting position, their hands and ankles bound by ropes, and their mouths gagged with, I don't know, probably a piece of cloth or something. They would also have their torso and thighs secured to the bench to prevent any unwanted thrashing from the pain that they're about to experience. One by one, bricks, or wooden slabs, would be placed under the victim's piggies, slowly elevating them higher and higher while the rest of their body remained locked in place. Now, unless you have the Tibio Taylor talent of a turkey, you can see where this is going. With each addition of a brick, your ligaments in your knees become hyperextended, painfully forcing your knee joint beyond its natural range of motion. If any of you less than limber people remember the ungodly sit and reach box from your middle school gym classes, just imagine that, but someone grabbing your arms and pulling you with all of their might. Then you might just get a lick of what that pain must feel like. The continuous hyperextension eventually leads to the shattering of the kneecaps and the splintering of the leg bones, utterly destroying muscles and tendons, rendering the victim's legs completely useless. Trust me, although this guy seems untroubled, inside, he's screaming. And if that weren't enough, prisoners would be bound in this position for days on end, to the brink of starvation and full sleep deprivation from the ongoing pain. Not only from the hyperextension, but from physical beatings to the rest of their body if they continued to refuse to confess. They don't know I'm a double-jointed masochist. Despite what the chill demeanors on these fellas' faces express, getting sawn vertically in half is not a pleasant experience. Although the act of sawing has been present throughout many different cultures in history, ancient Roman and Chinese versions were mainly done transversely, or at the waist. But some sadistic buttholes thought, nah, not painful enough. Let's try a different axis. And you know what? Let's hang them upside down too. We'll start shredding the sack, split the crack, go down the hull and to the skull. The method is pretty self-explanatory. A victim will be hoisted up upside down with arms and legs secured to two posts, usually with their dangly bits out. The condemned would then have a big ol' saw ripped through their bodies like a slice of birthday cake. On the bright side, the poor soul would most likely be long dead or at the very least unconscious before the saw ever got that far thanks to the excruciating pain and severe blood loss. Documented cases of this particular path of punishment are rare, but some stories have survived. The most known case being that of Simon the Zealot, one of the 12 apostles of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. If you've ever seen Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, he's the less detailed guy all the way at the end of the table getting ridiculed by these two fine gents for asking, "When can we eat?" Very little is known about poor Simon at all, being only passively mentioned in the Bible. History states that he preached across Egypt and Persia, with the latter being the place of his demise. Apparently, the Persians weren't too happy with the door-to-door preachings of Simon, so much so that they saw to his end. Literally. According to some historians, around the year 65 AD, at the age of 60, Simon was spread in two while spreading the word of the Lord. For his dedication to the J-Man, Simon was made a saint in the Catholic Church, with many depictions of him holding a long saw, similar to the one that ripped through his being. Ironically enough, he was also made the patron saint of tanners and sawyers, which really sucks. I mean, imagine the way you died being your eternal legacy. Like, oh damn guys, you hear that Peter got nailed by a 37 Nissan Altima last week? Better make him the patron saint of pedestrians. But hey, when you walk with Jesus, we're all jaywalkers. Oftentimes we find that nature is already well equipped with possible torture resources, and it doesn't even have to be something large or intimidating. Sometimes it's the small things that pack the biggest punch. Well, turns out that quite a few groups of people around the world took advantage of nature's blessings. Like this little guy. This is a Pseudomyrmex triplarinus, but you can call it a little ouch. This agonizing arthropod is a venomous species of ant most commonly found in the northern areas of South America. These ants contain a cytotoxic venom, which if you remember my little toxins rhyme from my worst jobs in history video, you'd know that cytotoxins cause extreme cellular damage and painful swelling, making it a perfect tool for devastating torture. For this section, we actually have a very modern use case. Back in 2014, a group of Bolivian villagers in the province of Ayopaya apprehended a pair of teenagers accused of stealing several motorcycles. Since the run-of-the-mill judicial penal system wasn't deemed effective enough, the villagers took matters into their own hands. The two upstanding criminals, aged 18 and 19, were strapped to a tree infested with venomous ants for 3 days. The young men writhed in pain for hours and hours on end, sustaining bites all over their bodies from head to toe. Chests were chomped, calves were crunched, nipples were nipped, and balls were bitten. It was only after being found by one of their sisters that the young men were freed from their pincer prison. Well, also after all of their relatives coughed up about $3,700 in cash as compensation for the bikes that were stolen. Gotta pay back your debt after all. Both men were rushed to intensive care, with one requiring dialysis to survive. But I bet they learned a valuable lesson. Don't take shit that doesn't belong to you. There have been other claims of ant torture throughout history, though, as a warning, these are more anecdotal than confirmed. It is said that the Apache people of the southern US and northern Mexico regions were capable of committing horrible acts of violence, but hey, when you're forced off your land, what are you gonna do? One such act was taking prisoners of war and burying them neck deep in the earth, allegedly near anthills containing red harvester ants. With a simple prod to the hill, thousands of ants pour out to defend their home, and being the nearest target, looks like you're the culprit. The red harvester ant latches onto your skin with its strong Chad-like mandibles and proceeds to repeatedly stab you with its stinger. Once stung, pheromones are released, chemically signaling other ants to swarm you. Your lips, your mouth, your ears, and even your eyes are all susceptible to the stings. The intense pain from just a single sting has been described as feeling like being prodded by a searing hot needle, lasting up to 8 hours. So it goes without saying that thousands of those would really suck. But don't worry, it's well documented that around 500 stings would be enough to kill a human. You're probably getting all itchy just thinking about them things crawling all over you, aren't you? Well, now you are. Our last stop on this journey takes place in the big old continent of Africa. Having dealt with colonization for centuries, the many countries of Africa are no stranger to pain. In fact, they're pretty good at dishing it out, especially to each other. Now, the concept of trial by ordeal is not exclusive to Africa. It's been seen across Europe, Persia, India, and Cambodia as well, but this segment focuses on Africa. Why? Because that's how I wrote the script and that's how I'm editing this video, so okay, so the idea behind the trial by ordeal is to determine the guilt or innocence of the accused through various means of torture. If you survive, you're innocent. If you die, you're guilty. Not that it mattered anymore, but there were many different ordeals to be trialed through. These are going to be a bit rapid fire, so stick with me. And speaking of which, the first one is the trial by fire. The accused would either be forced to walk along a length of hot coals, hold scalding hot metal, or retrieve items from cauldrons of boiling hot oil. If the victim showed no visible signs of injury, they would be considered innocent. But that's just setting people up for failure. These examples of trial by fire have been historically documented across Togo, Nigeria, and Sudan. Next was the self-explanatory trial by poison. The accused would drink toxic concoctions consisting of various local poisons. In Liberia and Ghana, victims enduring the trial would be forced to ingest the bark of the sassywood tree. Alright, which one of you drank all the sassywood juice? No, I don't want to drink that stuff. Nope. Was it you? The bark of the sassywood tree contains erythrofleine, a powerful poison that can fuck up your heart. But as long as you regurgitate that slop out of your system, you're right as rain, and considered innocent. Similarly, some prisoners in Sierra Leone or Nigeria would drink a solution made from the calabar bean, which contains physostigmine, an acetylcholine esterase inhibitor. If you've never seen my chemical weapons video, this is just a fancy way of saying that it causes life-threatening seizures and a loss of your respiratory control, causing you to choke to death. One final trial would be the trial by water. Popular in pre-colonial Côte d'Ivoire, the accused would have their hands and feet bound and be tossed in the local river. Those who were able to break free of their bindings and swim to the surface were absolved of their crimes, while those who sank like stones were doomed to figuratively and literally drown in their guilt. Talk about washing away your sins. History facts that are wrong. This is probably one of the first things we all learned about in school when discussing ancient Egypt. Tens of thousands of slaves enduring endless hours of intense, forced physical labor while barely being fed or provided with adequate water. Drop a sack of sand, chisel something at the wrong angle, devout masochist, you're getting a whipping. Well, it's all poppycock. While there were slaves, they were mainly prisoners of war or household servants who tended to their landlords, but they weren't really part of the main labor force. Instead, laborers in ancient Egypt were conscripted using the corvée duty system, a way to pay off taxes through manual labor. According to the book The Pyramid Builders of Ancient Egypt, which discusses the pyramid builders of ancient Egypt, farmers were usually pulled from their laborious crop dusting for construction work whenever the Nile went all floody during the summer months. While the snobby rich upper class folk avoided manual labor by just paying off their tax burden, them smelly poors were tasked with construction of temples, tombs, and pyramids. Laborers who worked on the pyramids, as well as other large structures way back in the ancient times, were actually well provided for. This makes sense, as having a weakened labor force due to neglect or malnourishment, it doesn't really pay great dividends. Can't exactly move giant rocks when you're completely emaciated. Small villages have been discovered built specifically for housing laborers. These sites also contain various animal bones and plentiful bread jars showing a high-quality diet. But of course, the system wasn't perfect. Thanks to some classic upper-class corruption, sometimes things didn't always go right for these laborers, but they had the power to stand their ground. Dating all the way back to 1170 BC, written evidence has been found of an artisan's strike while constructing a tomb for then-pharaoh Ramesses III. The artisans complained about a lack of promised rations and outright refused to continue their work, dropping their chisels and their hammers to march right up to the ruling class's temples to make their demands. What do we want? Food! When do we want it? Food! After chit-chatting with the local vizier, the workers were able to secure the rations and continued their work. Now don't get me wrong, the labor that these guys endured was backbreaking, extremely strenuous, and downright exhausting, but they weren't outright enslaved or mistreated, as historians previously thought. We've all heard the legends about King Tut's tomb, right? If you disturb an ancient king's burial grounds, you'll be cursed, doomed to die a horrible death. Well, it's not so. You'd probably cough a bit from inhaling millennia-old mummy powder, but that's about it. Now, there has been evidence of some ancient tombs inscribed with curse-like carvings. For example, ancient warlord and Egyptian noble Ankh-Tifi wrote that, quote, "Any ruler who shall do evil or wickedness to his coffin, may the gods not accept any goods he offers, and may his heir never inherit." Similarly, an inscription on the tomb of 10th century BC ruler Kentika Ikeki warns that any impure men who enter this tomb, there will be judgment. An end shall be made for him. I shall seize his neck like a bird, and I shall cast the fear of myself into him. Now, in a culture that was super superstitious, anyone coming across warnings like that would be like, "Oh shit! A ghost! prompting them to 180 right out of the room. When King Tut's tomb was discovered in 1922, no such written reprimands or warnings were ever found. In reality, the rumor of King Tut's curse revolves around one George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a rich English white dude who funded the whole expedition that led to the discovery of the Sandy sarcophagus. He died a whole 4 months after the opening of the tomb, after which a journalist did what journalists do and printed a whole bunch of sensationalized fake news, attributing Lord Carnarvon's death to an inexplicable curse. To no surprise, the media ran with it, making claims of a written curse being uncovered with the tomb, though this never happened. So how did Lord Carnarvon die? He done got bit by a mosquito. The resulting bump was accidentally slashed while he was shaving, making a pretty nasty cut that later got infected. The old chap died of blood poisoning at the age of 56. Dedicated believers have tried to attribute other deaths to the curse, but they're really grasping for straws. Of the 58 people who were present at the opening of the tomb, only 8 had died within a dozen years of the discovery, and by various means ranging from cancer to murder to natural causes. The majority of the men went to live on full, healthy lives. At least they didn't steal any spooky slabs. That might have been a different story. When you think of Spartans, you probably think about them slippery, shiny hunks of warrior man meat as portrayed on the silver screen. A society of strict and viciously trained bloodthirsty warriors who could decimate any opposing army. But while you're thinking about oiled up, shirtless, muscular men, you might question if this portrayal is historically accurate. It's not. In reality, the Greek city-state of Sparta had no professional army. Although growing up with militaristic training, the purpose was not to create warriors, but perfected, hardened, and respectable citizens who could serve to defend their homeland if need be. That little element of perfection is where some rumors of Spartan eugenics come in. It is believed that ancient Spartans practiced infanticide, the act of killing deformed or undesired babies as a way to strengthen the Spartan society. However, the biggest downfall of this myth is that there's only one historical source that alludes to this barbaric practice, and it's this guy, Roman historian Plutarch. He wrote that Spartan elders would examine newborns for imperfections or weaknesses. Good, bad, good. What the?
Hello, Daddy.
Ew. If any were ever found, they would just yeetus the fetus off the Taygetus mountainside. This ensured that only the best of the best would be able to thrive to crushing adulthood. But this bit of literature is almost certainly a bunch of baloney. While historians can't confirm with 100% certainty, they can confirm with 99.9% certainty that this just flat out never happened. Excavations around the proposed baby hucking sites have failed to present any supporting evidence. There have been a few adult remains discovered, but no teeny tiny toddler tibias were ever among them. If you needed more convincing, Plutarch's writings date some 600 years after the height of Spartan civilization, so it might have just been some silly Spartan slander. That would be like if future archaeologists in the year 4000 unearthed fanfiction from today about how medieval Europeans would just shit their britches to ward off witches. Sure, it's questionable, but you could kind of see that happening, right? Despite what you may think, death was not the goal of gladiator battles in the Roman Colosseum. If it was, Rome would have run out of them real quick. Now keep in mind that the Colosseum was active for over 400 years, hosting a plethora of different events ranging from gladiator battles to public criminal executions to full-fledged naval battle reenactments with the entire Colosseum being flooded. Pretty wild, right? Well, gladiator battles were basically the equivalent of today's UFC or boxing matches, just with swords and spears instead of fists. These fights were spectacles of sport, and the gladiators were the athletes. You had some super famous gladiators, rookie gladiators, and everything in between. While some gladiators were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war fighting for their chance of freedom, most of the big old brutes fought for fame and fortune, or just the high-octane dopamine rush of being able to legally stab someone in the kidney and getting praised for it. Roman citizens were hyped to watch two dudes duke it out in a sweaty, sandy, sassy struggle of strength. But things were a lot more exciting than just the vanilla missionary position 9-to-5 white picket fence 1.5 children-ass sword and shield type gladiators. Nope. Actually, there were about 30 different types of gladiators ready to clang and bang away at each other. You had your dual-wielding Demochirus, the trident-chucking Retiarius, the silly-looking Caesar, and the alls-out, balls-out Cestus, among other DLC characters. So imagine that you're living your boring Roman life, sitting in your boring Roman house, scratching your boring Roman balls when you suddenly catch wind of the gladiator battle of the century. Two andabate pitted against each other. You'd lose your shit. Why would you lose your shit? Because andabate were condemned criminals fighting each other completely blind. Yeah, as a form of punishment, 2 criminals equipped with nothing more than a sealed helmet and a rusty sword were dumped out into the arena and forced to square off. It's like watching 2 blindfolded kids trying to whack at a piñata, except they're both potential piñatas. Now, while formal gladiator duels were not to the death, of course some still died, but it was more common to die by bleeding out after the match had been called by the referee. Oh yeah, they had referees. These were often retired gladiators tasked with making sure that the rules of battle were being followed and stopping fights before final blows were dealt. You see, gladiators were expensive investments, so their managers wanted them alive for as long as possible, lest they start all over leveling up another rookie from scratch. So with all that being said, professional gladiator battles were not performed for the sake of death, just for the thrill of the fight, and the potential of death. Ancient myths are tough for modern historians to interpret, as historical writers across time have their own biases. Depending on how they felt about a certain historical figure, they could cement their legacy in history as a smart fella or a fart smella. The prevailing myth that Roman Emperor Nero diddled his fiddle as Rome burned to the ground is one that should go up in smoke. It's commonly believed that Nero, having descended into madness over the course of his reign, started the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, a disastrous and destructive inferno that destroyed nearly 3/4 of the Roman capital. Accusations claim that Nero didn't really like the look of Rome and wanted to rebuild it in his own vision with a lavish and gaudy golden palace, so a conveniently timed fire would have been a great opportunity to do so. The fire is suspected to have started in a shopping district stockpiled with flammable goods. Once the fire started, it was nearly impossible to contain. Rome was a dense city, streets were narrow, housing structures were wooden, and the wind was a-blowin'. This set of conditions provided the perfect environment for the big ol' fire to really roar. The blaze lasted for 9 whole days, decimating 10 of Rome's 14 districts. But was Emperor Nero to blame? Not at all. According to Tacitus, one of the most influential Roman historians at the time, Nero was not near Rome when the fire started. He was actually several miles away in the coastal town of Antium, but he rushed back home to Rome once he caught wind of the disaster. When he did get back, Nero actually funded relief efforts and opened up private gardens and other structures for shelter to those affected. Despite these efforts, Nero still came under scrutiny from the nobles who hated him, claiming that he should have responded sooner and provided more assistance.
Freaking Nero, dude. I bet my scorched ass cheeks he started that fire himself. Yeah, you're right, he probably did.
Guys, he was literally miles away in another city.
What did you do?
And that's how rumors start. In actual fact, there is no historical evidence that Nero started the fire, and especially no evidence that he played the fiddle when Rome burned. Mostly because the fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 900 years. It's probable that the claim is part of Christian propaganda, as Nero famously blamed them for the fire, leading to their persecution. So who really got the last laugh? It was Nero. He burned a lot of Christians. It's possible that your middle school history textbooks may have toyed with the idea that ancient Aztecs, or even the greater Mexican people as a whole, saw the invading Spanish conquistadors as godlike figures. More specifically, history has suggested that the Aztec ruler Moctezuma, or Montezuma, however you want to pronounce it, believed that the arrival of the Spanish coincided with the prophesied return of Quetzalcoatl, the Mesoamerican feathered serpent god of creation. But we now know that it's all, as the Spanish say, a bunch of caca. It's certainly true that the native Mexican people were stunned and confused by the appearance of the foreign invaders with their fancy horses, gunpowder, and white skin, but there's no evidence explicitly stating that they were thought of as gods. Letters written by Hernan Cortés himself about his conquests never mention being mistaken for or being interpreted as a god in any way, shape, or form. And this is further supported by the writings of Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who chronicled Cortez's conquests in real time. One passage highlights a conversation between Cortez and Moctezuma in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Conversation basically had Moctezuma being like, yeah, people around here think I'm a god, that I'm all about gold and silver and precious stones, but look, you see that? Flesh and blood, my dude. We're both the same. I know that you're just a bunch of foreigners and not some otherworldly divine beings. That would just be silly. To which Cortez replied, so where did this idea come from? Well, it actually started to surface decades after the Aztecs were conquered. Publications of Spanish conquests alluded to the idea that Cortez and his men tried to pass their weapons off as magic and their horses off as intelligent, aggressive beasts. So it was mainly a sensationalized retelling of events, portraying the Mexican people as more feeble-minded, all while embellishing the Spanish image. As it turns out, the Aztec weren't bamboozled by some distrustful deity. The Spanish completely steamrolled the Aztec with the help of guns, alliances to Aztec rivals, and every European explorer's iconic weapon, disease. It was less, oh my god, and more,
Oh my god!
The Great Depression was truly a financial disaster, not only for the US, but for the entire globe. Most of you out there might recall learning that the stock market crash of 1929 caused the Great Depression, but in reality, it was just the signal that shit had hit the financial fan. Nothing more than a devastating effect from a much more threatening underlying cause. If you're unaware, the world economy is a constant struggle for balance of supply and demand, with price being the end result. Lots of demand and no supply, prices go up. Lots of supply but no buyers, prices go down. Sure, that's a bit oversimplified, but you get the idea. The Great Depression was a catastrophic chain of events stemming from US overproduction of goods. You see, in the early 1920s, the world had entered a time of peace at the end of World War I. This led to an industrial boom. Not for war machines, but for consumer goods. Mass production was going wild, and factories were farting out new products like crazy. To sell these products, companies began aggressive advertising campaigns. The news, radio, magazines, and everything just screamed in your face to buy the latest and greatest doohickey. And the people did. But how could customers afford all of this lavish spending? Yup, the establishment of consumer credit. Cars, appliances, clothes, homes, all purchased on credit. But the United States was not the only beneficiary of a peacetime economy. European and Asian markets began producing their own goods, selling these products to the US for cheaper prices, which caught the eyes of consumers looking to save a few pennies here and there. The big American companies, seeing potential profits leaving their grubby hands, were pissed and lobbied Congress to protect their interests. In order to do so, the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922 was passed. This raised American tariffs across the board, increasing the consumer cost of foreign goods as to thin out the competition and force Americans to buy American products. Europe and Asia promptly responded in kind, and soon a tariff war commenced. All this sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? Now, in order to keep a super long story super short, here's what happened next. Demand shrank as American companies and farms overproduced their goods. Too much stuff and no one to buy it means less sales. Less sales means less profit for these companies, and with less company profit, that means they're gonna start handing out some pink slips. With lots of people laid off, lots of people have less money to spend, so companies lose even more money, and if they lose enough of it, they go bankrupt. Now, when companies went bankrupt, at least back in the 1920s, the banks that supported them failed. And when the banks failed, people's money straight up vanished, thanks to the lack of FDIC insurance. Everyone loses their shit and rushes to withdraw money from whatever banks are still standing, but there's not enough physical cash to meet that demand. Now, all of a sudden, no one has money. So what happened to it all? The banks lent it out to all the rich people, placing speculative bets on the stock market. Now, when there's a lot of market speculation, stock market prices get unreasonably high. Unreasonably high prices aren't very sexy, so no one else wants to buy them. Instead, they sell to take profits. But when these profits are taken, that stock price drops. When stock prices drop, any remaining shareholders lose potential profit, which is no bueno. So they panic sell whatever shares they have. And when there's enough seller momentum across the board, the entire stock market crashes. So banks have failed, blue-collar workers have lost their life savings overnight, millionaires have lost their fortunes, factories have folded, and farmers have hung up their tools. Not only did this cripple the United States, but the entirety of global trade. The United States could not meet critical export demands, and foreign economies selling raw materials such as sugar, rubber, and lumber lost their biggest customer, and thus most of their money, impacting their economies. The Great Depression was without doubt one of the worst economic disasters of the modern age. The American economy struggled until the United States entered World War II in 1941, where demand for production and labor picked right back up. To put it simply, the 1929 stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. It was the writing on the wall that the system was breaking. Afterward, the banking system was overhauled and the stock market heavily regulated to prevent history from repeating itself. And we'll see how that goes.